Next up in our reading through the Bible together, we're looking at Genesis chapter 4. We've looking now at the consequences and the results of the infiltration of sin into the world. We saw that in chapter 3, and it's the sin of Adam and Eve, and then the judgment that God brought upon all of creation as a result. But now we're starting to see very quickly what that really looks like in everyday practice. And we have a very ugly scene right off the bat in chapter 4, where the first two men born into this world, Cain and Abel, are not doing well together as brothers. They're two different men. They're both, at first, they seem to be doing well. They're not, no issue. They both bring an offering to God. And so that's very good. Now, there's nothing in Scripture up to this point that told them to bring an offering to God that we have. Perhaps God verbally told them this, or somehow they knew. I don't know exactly, but both of them bring an offering as an act of worship to God. Abel brings a blood offering, sacrificial offering. Cain, who apparently was a vegetarian or something like that, brings something out of his garden. And contrary to what many have said over the years, what Cain's offering was not bad. It was not wrong. There had not been any indication that we know of that a blood offering, a sacrificial offering, was necessary. So as far as we know, that portion of what Cain did was fine. It's not until we get to the New Testament in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that it becomes clear that the difference between the two offerings was not the substance of the offering, it was the heart of the offering. Abel brought an offering, a sacrifice by faith, trusting not in his own works and his own efforts, but in God himself. And he brought that sacrifice to God in faith. Cain did not do that. Cain brought an offering that was unacceptable to God. We see that right here in verse 4 of chapter 4 of Genesis. The Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering, but for Cain, verse 5, and his offering he had no regard. Now that was because, I believe, Cain was trying to please God in his own efforts, basically what we would call it today a works righteousness. He was not bringing an offering by faith. He was bringing an offering of works, and God rejected that offering. And as a result of that, verse 5, it says that he was very angry, and his countenance fell. Now, why was he angry, and who was he angry at? Well, if we look at our text here, he was angry because God rejected his offering. And so he had to be angry not at Abel, but at God. God's the one that rejected it, but he didn't like the fact that God had accepted Abel's. And so he begins to think of a way to take it out on his brother. And of course, he does that. But before he does, the Lord comes to him in verse 6 and says, "Why are you angry? And why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and it's desirous for you, and you must master it." Now God goes to him and said, "Look, I see what's going on here. Your anger is beginning to master you. It's beginning to control you. And if you do not control it, bad consequences are going to come from this." And so the Lord warns him that this sinful behavior is crouching at the door. Sin is crouching at the door. What a picture. It's a picture of like a tiger or something that is crouching, ready to spring, not yet jumped, not yet devoured, but getting ready to do so. And God warns him this is happening. But you must master it, he said. But of course, Cain does not. And he goes out and he takes an opportunity to murder his brother because he's mad at God. And he's taking it out on his brother. When God comes to confront him on this is where we get our famous statement in verse 9. All Cain can say is, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Well, that doesn't fool God, of course. And so the Lord brings a cursing upon him, starting in verse 11, that is just overwhelming to Cain, and God does some things to keep him from being immediately killed. But this is the beginning of a infantation of sinful behavior and action on the part of the descendants of Cain. It's a very ugly picture, but it's demonstrating to us how it is that sin grabs a hold of our hearts. I don't think there's any place in the Bible that is any better than this chapter 4 of Genesis to talk to us about how we can master sin and how sin is crouching ready to leap upon us and devour us. And yet God says, you can master this. And through God's power, he could have. But he refused to do so. He allowed sin to get the upper hand. And as a result of that, he did an awful thing, and he paid the price. What a picture of sin and its power, but also of the grace of God, where we can have victory if we come to him by faith alone.